Hello, everybody. I'm Kwaku Ngissa with Harrison Sloan, for those who don't know. Um, and welcome to today's meeting about heat pump water heaters. Can they deliver? Now, last year, Harrison Sloan was on tour talking to clients and consultants about the 2022 Energy Code and getting everybody prepared. After each of those presentations, people tend to come to us with different questions and concerns. And over the months, we collected them and started to see some of the same repeating concerns. So this webinar and the rest of the webinar series is an opportunity for us to distill that information and provide it to the broader building community. So if you have more questions or more things that you don't think are being covered in this series, please be sure to let us know, drop it in the chat, send us an email, and maybe we can build another webinar around that. Today specifically, we're looking at the question of heat pump water heaters. Can they deliver? And when we ask that question, we're really looking at two large groups of stakeholders, right? The first one is the building community, which is all of the people who are here in attendance. And the other stakeholder is the buyer, who's going to be living side by side with that heat pump water heater potentially for years to come. Now, for those of you who are sitting in this presentation, I hope you're not asking, but if you are, if you're asking the question, can I avoid heat pump water heaters? The answer is you can try, but it's going to become mandatory. It's going to become the standard. I don't have a crystal ball, but looking at the patterns, this is how I can tell. 10, 15 years ago, gas tanked water heaters were the building standard. With the 2013 code cycle, the CEC introduced gas tankless ready requirements, right? So you had to set up infrastructure for a gas tankless water heater. The next code cycle in 2016, the CEC effectively made it mandatory and it became the builder standard. We're seeing a similar sort of thing play out this code cycle, right? The 2022 code cycle this year right now, you have to install heat pump water heater ready infrastructure. That means you have to set aside space. You have to run plumbing in such a way that you will be able to easily install a heat pump water heater. Extrapolating from that, we can imagine that in the 2025 code cycle, heat pump water heaters will probably become mandatory. Now, we are talking with the CEC, working with them on the 2025 code cycle, so obviously we'll be able to see that when it comes up. But if you're building in Dublin, or if you're building in Sacramento, or any of the many other jurisdictions that already have electrification mandatory requirements, you're actually already there, right? You have to build with a heat pump water heater in those particular jurisdictions. This slide isn't meant to bully anybody or scare anybody necessarily. It's just to set the reality. And I hope that it also brings a little bit of comfort to you because, again, we've done storage water heaters before, right? That was the standard 10, 15 years ago. We can figure out how to do it again. The heat pump water heater part, it's not that new and it's not that fancy. So we got this. Now, for my area of expertise, energy compliance, do heat pump water heaters deliver? The answer is a resounding absolutely yes. For those of you here who were at the presentations last year, this table on the screen should look pretty familiar. You don't need to go through any of the details, just remember that red means not compliant and green means compliant. Now this is what it's showing. If you were to take a 2019 model home that is compliant and you were to run it as it is under the 2022 code, you're going to find that it's not compliant by the energy code standards. But if you make a single change of pulling out the gas tankless water heater and replacing it with a heat pump water heater, everything turns green and we find that it's in compliance. Right? That one single change by itself is enough to bring 2019 compliant homes into compliance in this current code cycle. So from a purely compliance standpoint, heat pump water heaters definitely deliver. But if you're here, I hope you already know that answer and you're really looking for deeper understanding of heat pump water heaters and how we can really make those work. So for that, I've brought in an actual heat pump water heating expert, Jordan Sussman. He's been working as the West Region sales manager for Rheem for over half a dozen years, and he's been in the water heating, specifically in the water heating industry, for longer than that. So I'll hand it over to you, Jordan.
Appreciate that, Kwaku. Let me take control of the presentation here really quick. Everybody can hear me and see me okay, I hope. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jordan Sussman. I work for Rheem Water Heating. We're very involved in this market transformation as pertains to heat pump water heaters, and we've tried over at least the last year and a half to provide some training to the building community as probably the most important stakeholder. You were the last to receive information about the code change itself, right? So I'm here to answer some of these questions about can heat pump water heaters deliver. Kwaku mentioned, the perspective of the builder is different than the perspective of the buyer. So we categorize these into the 3 C's for both. For the builder, how do I meet code with a heat pump water heater? What are the strategies to make sure that we have customer satisfaction? And can I get them, right? Are they available? This is a major change that's happening. It's new to our business here in California, and we want to make sure that there's ample supply. From a buyer's perspective, there's a couple of different ways to look at this, right? For a buyer cares about a handful of things. Comfort, right? Can I get hot water from this machine, right? And how much hot water? Capability, how much hot water will it produce, and will it be enough for my family? And cost. This is an electric water heater. I'm aware that electric rates are fairly high. That sounds expensive to me. So hopefully I can answer a few of these questions as we breeze through this material. In order to answer those questions, I need to go over a handful of things. One, what are the code requirements specifically around heat pump water heaters? I need to introduce or reintroduce the technology so that we can have a firm understanding on the differences of heat pump water heaters from what we've been using in the past, and understand the strategy that the state is using this technology. Because they're vastly different than what we've been using in the past, I'm talking about tankless water heaters, we need to discuss sizing and the strategies around sizing heat pump water heaters for a given plant type. There's a little bit of theory involved in that, but I'll touch on those. And then there's a handful of other design considerations specifically around the buyer's comfort, right? Living with this water heater into the future. And again, if there's any questions that come up, usually I'll allow folks to interrupt me during my meetings. Since there's so many of you, please write down your questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end to address them. So from a code perspective, separate of compliance that Kwaku was going over, the requirements are fairly simple. The code says in a new construction single-family residential, it needs to be a individual 240 volt heat pump water heater. It has to be rated by the rating agency NEIA to be tier 3 or higher. There is now tier 4 water heaters in the marketplace. And from an installation standpoint, it has to be installed in the garage or the conditioned space. Now, from an installation standpoint, I believe they added this into the code so that we don't install them outside, or we don't install them in outdoor closets where they're going to be pulling air only from the outside environment, where the winter months may cause some problems. And we'll touch on that on the technology slide. So from a technology standpoint, you'll notice these are tank water heaters. We are storing water. Because the state of California is going in this direction to get rid of gas appliances, they needed a very efficient solution to heat water using electricity. The only way to do that is with a heat pump. So if you were getting 0.93 UEF, 0.96 UEF with a tankless water heater, now we're getting upwards of 3.5 to 3.7 UEF with all the heat pump water heaters that are on the market. How do we do that? Simply put, heat pump water heaters pull heat out of the ambient air, run it through some refrigerant, superheat that refrigerant. That refrigerant coil is wrapped around the steel body of the tank. that heat is allowed to pass into the tank and into the water, and that process repeats itself. We're able to get those very high efficiencies because we're moving heat. We're not creating it by burning gas or firing electric elements. However, because this is a very slow process, two things are present. One, these are the heat pump water heaters are designed to manage peak loads. Okay. And if the peak load exceeds the capability of the heat pump to heat water, there are additional backup electric elements built into these water heaters, very similar to heat strip technology in HVAC systems. Now, previously mentioned, we're storing an amount of hot water. From a sizing standpoint, when we were installing tankless water heaters, the market eventually figured out, how many BTUs of a water heater we're going to need for X amount size of a home. And that sort of normalized after a handful of years. We didn't get any support from the plumbing code. Moving back to stored water volumes, we do get a little bit of support, or at least guidance, from the plumbing code in the form of first hour delivery rating. Okay. Now, this is based on the theoretical occupancy and the theoretical fixture capability in a given home. It is not based on high flow fixtures. The state of California has already shifted to Cal Green many years ago. What I'm referring to mostly are tubs, etc. Bathing tubs, Roman tubs. Those are not accounted for in this sizing strategy. But what you'll notice in this chart is there's a matrix between the number of bathrooms and the number of bedrooms. And at the very bottom, it calculates a first hour delivery requirement to meet the theoretical peak loads in this given house. Now, for the last handful of years, the state's been collecting data on hot water use, and the averages show that most of the time, hot water is used in the morning and in the evening. So if we, with a heat pump water heater, can heat that water and then support that load, that peak load in the morning and in the afternoon, we can remain extremely efficient. If the buyer or the homeowner at this point exceeds the capability of the stored water, whether it's a 50 gallon, a 65 gallon, or an 80 gallon, the electric elements will turn on. Now, as previously mentioned, that is a little bit faster than a heat pump water heater to heat water, but it's also more expensive. So from a cost standpoint, that cost will go up. Okay. So from a buyer's perspective, there's a handful of things to consider. As the builder, you need to meet the requirement based on that previous chart. But consider a handful of options. What is the community price point, the community prestige? Do we want to just offer the bare minimum for these buyers, right? Are we installing some Roman tubs and expect that these buyers are going to use them, right? They're sellable. Are we marketing as multi-gen? Is there going to be a lot of people in this house, the particular plan type? So these are things we need to consider, and there's not enough time on this to dive into individual plans that you guys may have. We can address that later on. So again, for the builder, can I meet code? Absolutely. There is a method to do so, and we can assist in that. Customer satisfaction. Well, that depends, right? Did we size the water heater correctly for the buyers in this particular community? The one thing I did not get to is, can I get them? And we don't have a slide on this specifically, but I'll let you know there is more than one brand operating in this market, and all of those brands have been extremely aware of this change happening in California, and they're all clamoring for your business. So there will be an ample supply of heat pump water heaters available during this transition, which will happen basically until the end of this year. and sometime into next year, it will be more normalized. There's plenty of time for more conversation on that later. From the buyer's perspective, we need to consider a handful of options. Because heat pump water heaters are moving air in their adjacent space, there is a fan there. There are moving parts. These water heaters create noise. Tankless water heaters also created a little bit of noise, but they were sealed. They had a front door on them, and that combustion and fan and air movement was all done outside. The heat pump water heater is going to be moving air inside the adjacent space. So there is a noise concern that we need to address, and we'll get to that. Capability, hot water delivery. Is it going to provide enough hot water for my family? Now, we talked about the averages. There are families out there that beat those expectations. A little bit of buyer education goes a long way, and I'll touch on that as well. Cost, from a cost perspective, I want you to consider a handful of things. If an electric utility rate is approximately 3 times greater than a gas utility, but we're using an electric appliance that is essentially 3 times more efficient than the previous used gas utility, gas appliance, the operating cost is a wash. Okay. Now, that is a very average statement, and that has to do specifically with hot water usage. The more hot water they use, the more the water heater is going to operate, and the more opportunity the electric elements have to heat water instead of the heat pump, which is the most expensive way to do it. So, in order to mitigate operational costs, stored water is the insurance policy. So, upgrading the stored water to the next size up is the method to handle that. Some other design considerations. I talked about noise a little bit. There are some strategies around making sure that the noise doesn't become a customer service complaint, right? So these are not necessarily in order, but number one is location. Decide where your heat pump water heater is going to go. From my conversations with the builder core, most often heat pump water heaters are going to be installed in the garage, most likely in a niche that's been cut out of the back of the garage. That doesn't say all of the builders are going to do it that way. The code allows for them to be installed in the conditioned space. You'll see this picture. This is installed in a closet inside of a home. It used to be a coat closet, and they repurposed it for a heat pump water heater. So if it's in the home, we need to consider that it's going to be making some noise, and a little bit of buyer education goes a long way. From an installation standpoint, there are a handful of things we can do to mitigate that. Tank water heaters require seismic straps for earthquake strapping, okay? The material of those straps will either insulate or perpetuate any noise and vibration going into the stud wall. So from Rheem's perspective, we recommend fabric earthquake straps for all heat pump water heater installations. It's a lot like seatbelt material. They're very rigid, very strong, and they're not very expensive. We also recommend, because there's a requirement for a drain pan, making sure that drain pan is either plastic or some sort of rubberized material. That will help dispel any vibration transferring into the adjacent space and thus causing a customer service complaint. Next slide, please. So we've just thrown a significant amount of information at you in a very, very short period of time. And that was designed to garner some questions from you. So I hope that you understand from a compliance standpoint that heat pump water heaters are here, they're on the horizon. I want you to understand that the technology is not new. It's been around for over 10 years, and it's being perfected by all the brands. And there are strategies to make this market transition fairly simple, and we're happy to help with that. Kwaku?
All right. Thank you very much, Jordan. I hope that, yeah, that was a lot of good information. I know, again, like you said, that was a lot for people. Let me, here, I think. All right, so let's take a look at the chat and see what kind of questions we have here. So is a pan required for installation if it's installed in the water garage? Jordan, you can speak more to that.
I can answer that. So the answer may be no. The plumbing code says if a leak is going to cause damage to the structure, then a drain pan needs to be installed. If you're in a garage and you're below the mud sill, essentially, a leaking water heater may not cause damage to the home. Now it's going to kill all those Amazon boxes that are sitting in there, but in that particular case, a water heater pan is not required. Now, from a heat transfer and noise standpoint, we would still recommend it. That way it can be plumbed to the outside. We're not damaging, whatever they're storing in their homes. And it's not the most costly part of this installation. But to answer your question, John, no, not necessarily required if it's in the garage.
All right. Thank you. Next question. Are you aware of similar requirements that might impact designs in Nevada? Maybe that's one to take offline, but do you have a quick response?
Yeah, so California is a fairly progressive state, and other states are adopting some of the same strategies that California does. So although immediately there's going to be no requirements for heat pump water heater technology in Nevada, you're going to start to see the trickling in of the interest from the buyer groups and potentially the shift away from gas in that particular market. So no, not immediately, but yes, at some point you'll start to see heat pump water heaters in Nevada. Breaku, you're muted. I'll take that next question. So it looks like James said, are platforms and seismic straps and bollards required? So I touched on seismic strapping, absolutely. Bollards are only required if the water heater is installed within that 20-foot garage length. If it's in a niche built into the back of the garage, it's protected, essentially by the framing, and a bollard is not required. But that's a local jurisdictional thing that we need to verify locally, wherever you're building. Brian's asking, if the water heater is in a closet, what is the venting requirements? Great question. We didn't touch on that. So heat pump water heater, because there's air exchange happening in order to collect that heat, the water heater needs access to something like 700 cubic feet of air. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean the closet itself has to be 700 cubic feet, but it has to have access. So if the adjacent space to the closet is ample, let's say 700 cubic feet or better, then you need to have adequate air exchange within that closet, which is measured by another term called net free area. All that really means is it needs to have a fully louvered door. If we do not want to use a fully louvered door, ducting can be added to these water heaters, and you can duct in or out so that you can gain access to 700 cubic feet of air. Hopefully that answers your question. Andy, same question. Do heat pump water heaters require venting? Venting, no, because that entails some sort of combustion, but potentially ducting. Karen, how does this system combat cold air in the winter months if air is the way it heats water? Another great question. So there is heat available in air at any temperature. Obviously, there's more heat available if it's hotter and more humid than there is if it's colder and drier. A couple of things. Your heating cycles will increase, okay? And the potential for the electric elements to turn on increases slightly if the loads don't change. So the electric elements are there as a backup, but essentially the water heater will run for longer periods of time. Don, plumbing drains for the condensation. Absolutely. So these water heaters, because they're pulling heat out of the air, they are also pulling moisture out of the air, and that moisture needs to be drained. It's non-acidic, different than the tankless water heaters we've been using, but it does need to drain, but it can go into a sanitary drain. You'll need to be careful because some jurisdictions require those drains to have trap primers. So be aware of that. Ask your plumbing trades about that. Does the appliance produce cold air into living space? If the water heater is in the living space, you are going to get some cold air. It has almost an air conditioning like process that's happening. You know, your refrigerator, right, at your home is a heat pump, but it's pulling heat out of the box and blowing it into the adjacent space. We are doing that same process in reverse, pulling heat out of the air and putting it into the space. The byproduct is cool conditioned air. So absolutely, there may be some cold air penetration in the space. How often does it run, assuming average demand? Very hard to say. It's a slow process. It depends on how much water was used, how much the water heater needs to raise in temperature. I've seen anything from 25 minutes to 2 hours. It just really depends. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Scott, you're asking about, can we address the sizing requirements for homes? I'm happy to do that. I'd like to do it offline so we can talk about the, you're asking if they exceed 3.5 baths. So what Scott's referencing is the table is up to 3.5 baths. So anything above 3.5 baths, according to that table, will need to be an 80-gallon or potentially multiple water heaters. So we can touch on a couple of strategies for that offline. But essentially, you're locked into an 80-gallon if you're building above 3.5 bath. Yes, we have access to the webinar. We're going to send a link for that. Brett, heat pump water heaters are not recommended to be located in exterior water heater closets. The state of California would prefer that heat pump water heaters are pulling their air from inside the garage or inside the conditioned space. Some local jurisdictions are allowing for heat pump water heaters to be installed in outdoor closets. They will operate down to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. So recommendations, of course, warmer air is better, but they will work in while pulling in outside air. Frank, is there a requirement for recirculation? Great question, Frank. Recirculation pumps can be used with heat pump water heaters. However, they need to be Title 24 compliant, which means they can run no longer than 5 minutes and they have to have temperature shut off. If I need to provide documentation on that, I'm happy to do so. But this is a question we get fairly often. Kwaku, do you want to open it up for verbal questions? We're having a technical difficulty. It sounds like he's muted as well. Karen, there's another question that came in here. Karen says, is it more efficient to run in the house versus the garage? The truth of the matter is efficiency is based on the heat of the air, the heat that's located in the air for this water heater to operate. It should be warmer in the house than it is in the garage during the winter months. But during the summer months, the reverse is true. So unless you plan on moving your water heater from the house to the garage during the seasonal changes, that's a hard question to answer. We are finding that for all the factors mentioned earlier, most builders are going to be putting them in the garage.
Okay, and thank you. And just to touch back on the recirc requirement, so there isn't a requirement for recirc, but if you are building recirc, there's some things to consider. Great. And then with regards to access to the webinar, we will be sending out the slides. At this point, we don't plan to put up the video or the recording, but we may at some future date. All right, David Best, I see that your hand is raised. You should be able to unmute.
The question is, how much sound do they generate, and is it a problem if they're positioned next to bedrooms?
So lots of manufacturers used to publish the actual decibel rating of noise. Unfortunately, decibels are not a good measurement, as you're going to inquire about all the ambient noise around it. So a lot of manufacturers have shifted away from that. We used to say heat pump water heaters generate what's known as conversational volume. So if you're having a conversation with somebody, that amount of noise is very similar. They're slightly louder than the new high efficient refrigerators. But what you're referencing is not necessarily noise, and it's more vibration. So if it's located adjacent to a bedroom where somebody may be sleeping, some mitigation for that vibration would be a good idea, as you're going to hear and feel the vibration more than you're going to hear the water heater operate. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Great. We got another question from SDK. Shows you're unmuted, but we can't. I'm not hearing anything. All right. SDK, maybe we'll come back to you. John Gross, sounds like you got a question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
I actually have a Rheem water heater in my house that was built in 1988, and miraculously it is still working. But
Wow.
I anticipate having to replace it. Would it be best for me to try to consider going with electric and having to run the new 220, or go with another gas? Or what's the longevity, or is there any testing been done on the tank or the heat pumps?
Yeah, so you're putting me on the spot in front of a lot of people, John. Thank you. So there's a couple of things. Heat pump water heaters in the design strategy they are now, where they have this integrated heat pump on top in the storage vessel, that has been around for about just over 10 years, about 11 or 12 years. We have seen that if water heaters are taken care of, they will last long after that, up to 20 years. Now, water quality in California is changing a lot, not for the better. So that needs to be considered. So if there's some maintenance and flushing or draining of the water heater, it could last quite a long time. The question of do I want to switch from gas to electric has a lot of different factors involved in it, up to and including cost of operation and of installation. I love heat pump water heaters. They're great. I do not have one in my home because it would be significantly cost prohibitive to install them, to remove the gas infrastructure and run the 240. But there are some California programs available to make that transition. And I can talk to you a little bit about that offline.
That'd be great if you could.
And I know we're probably gonna have a few more questions, but in case anybody's got to drop off, just want to conclude a little bit. So can heat pump water heaters deliver? Yes, absolutely they can. Heat pump water heaters are not an if, but a when. Eventually, everybody's gonna probably have to install them. To provide the best user experience, again, they have to be sized based on actual expected usage. So the CEC requirements are a great starting point, but it is only a starting point. And of course, the most important thing is to educate the buyer to set up reasonable expectations. That's what's going to prevent them from coming back saying, we have no idea why this is behaving this way. All right. There are a few other webinars in this series. January 25th, we'll be talking about battery storage ready. February 1st, we'll be looking at 200 amp panels and if that's enough for electric ready. And then February 8th, we're going to look at incentive money and how to make sure that the dollars start to pencil out a bit better. Here's all of our contact information for anybody again who needs to drop off. If you need to reach out to Jordan, you can reach out to him. If you want to reach out to myself or Cubano, please, we're very happy to hear anything any questions you have about this or any other topics really. All right, let's see. So SDK, you still have your hand up, or have you been able to get your mics to work?
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
So very quickly, the water heater goes in the garage in a niche. Does it have to be certain inches off the ground?
It doesn't. So that is an old code requirement for open element gas water heaters. The idea was if there was a gas leak at some point, gas is heavier than air and it would sink to the floor and it wouldn't necessarily rise above 18 inches. So water heaters had to be installed 18 inches higher. Now, because there's no gas, there's no combustion, and everything is sealed, there's no legal requirement to raise it. What we're seeing is usually that niche is on the house slab, which is just slightly higher than the garage slab. So you do get a little bit of fall for drainage and other things, but there's no requirement for it. They do not need a platform. They do not need that 18 inches.
Thank you.
And then, see, we have another question from David.
Yeah, just real quick. You said it needs a 240 circuit, but what's the typical amperage draw? Does it vary by the size, or and Kwaku, you guys will probably get to this in your is 200 amp panel enough conversation, but what kind of power
David,
demand?
Great question. So I missed that on this presentation. The code says it needs to be a 240 volt, 30 amp heat pump water heater.
Does that vary by size, or are they all 30 amps? 30 amps.
All the heat pump water heaters that are available for new construction are 240 volt, 30 amp. There are some in the marketplace that are 120 volt. There are some that are 15 amp, but those are not designed for new construction and probably not legal per code.
Great, thank you.
All right, we got a couple more questions here in the chat, and then I think we'll be able to wrap it on up. If the trend continues in 2025 and heat pump water heaters are required, are current manufacturers in the position to meet the demand? Absolutely.
This is a great question. I can only speak for my organization, which is Rheem Water Heating. The political answer to your question is we've been communicating with the state on their intentions for the last 6 years or so. And we've been watching the marketplace from a volume standpoint very closely. It behooves my organization to make sure that we can meet the demand and obviously compete with our competitors in the space. That coupled with the fact that we do have some competitors, the answer to your question is an astounding yes. There will be enough heat pump water heaters to meet demand. Now, I will tell you, all the manufacturers were subject to some issues a handful of months ago, about a year and a half ago, when there was a computer chip shortage, because they do have a little onboard computer. A lot of that, from a sourcing standpoint, has been mitigated by all brands, and we are, building inventory and all of these things to make sure that there are no supply issues moving forward. Doesn't mean that another world disaster wouldn't change that. Hope that answers your question, Caleb.
All right, and then the last question, John asks, how high off the floor is the condensate?
So if you'll remember, maybe Kwaku, you can go to the picture of the heat pump water heater. There's two sections. The heat pump is located on the top of the water heater, just above this seam. I can't show you, but that seam. And the condensate is right at the bottom of that heat pump assembly. So essentially, depending on what size water heater you use, you have 50 inches above the ground for fall, basically. That answers your question. There was one more question in here, Kwaku, from James. Would it make sense to put the water heater on a spring isolated platform? Talking to a water heater nerd like myself, absolutely, that would help add some vibration isolation capability. But from a production standpoint, that seems cost prohibitive. That those types of assemblies are not necessarily inexpensive. I would rather see something like rubber feet installed on the bottom of the water heater on whatever platform it is, or very simply a rubberized water heater pan, which would serve the same purpose. There are some pans that add a lift inside the inside the pan itself.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I know we went a bit over time, but again, we're very happy to answer the questions that you have. If more come up regarding this or really any other topics, reach out to myself, reach out to Abe, reach out to Jordan, and we're more than happy to direct you in the right direction or provide the answers directly ourselves. All right.
Kwaku, there was a comment in the chat. If we could consolidate all of these questions that were asked
Yes.
and provide some short answer to it, that would be good. And I can work with you on that.
Yeah, we'll absolutely do that, and we'll attach that along with the presentation slides. Thanks, everybody.